Good evening. My name is Joseph Masad. I'm a professor here at Columbia University, and I welcome you to the 6th Edward Said Memorial Lecture. Allow me to begin with just some brief comments about recent developments in the Arab world, some of which will be covered in our major presentation this evening, before I introduce our distinguished guest speaker for this special evening. Since World War II, but more diligently since the mid-1950s, the United States has followed two simultaneous strategies to exercise its control over the Arab peoples across Arab countries. The first, and the one most relevant to Arabs, was based on the early US recognition and realization, like Britain, France, and Italy before it, that Arabs, like all other peoples worldwide, wanted democracy and freedom and would struggle for them in every possible way. For the US, this necessitated the establishment of security and repressive apparatuses in Arab countries, which the US would train, fund, and direct in order to suppress the democratic desires and efforts in support of dictatorial regimes whose purpose has always been and continues to be the defense of US security and business interests in the region. These interests consist principally in strengthening the Israeli settler colony and in securing and maintaining US control of the oil resources of the region and securing profits for American business. Much of this was, of course, propelled by the beginning of the Cold War and the US strategy to suppress all forms of real and imagined communist-leaning forces around the world, which included any and all democratic demands for change in the region. The strategy, which was formalized in the Eisenhower Doctrine in 1957, continues through the present. The second strategy was one that Edward Said understood early on and did much to explicate, namely the American importation of European Orientalism, a traveling theory that acquired a central place in post-war US academia. State Department funding, assisted by funding from private foundations, would solidify Orientalist research that asserted that Arabs and Muslims were incompatible with democracy, and that more often than not they love and prefer dictatorial rule, and that it would be culturally imperialist for the US to impose democracy on them, leading to the conclusion that it would be best to uphold the dictatorial rulers whose repressive policies, we are told, are inspired by Islam and Arab culture. Recent media pundits have also explained to us that Arab democracy would mean Islamist rule, which is also not in the US interest. Between the billions spent on repressing the Arab peoples and the millions spent to explain academically the need to repress them, this two-pronged US strategy in the region since World War II has been coming apart at an accelerated rate since January 2011, a development that continues to cause panic in the Obama White House and manifests in the incessant fumbling of his Secretary of State, who is much despised across the Arab world. The ongoing Arab revolution is exploding many of these Orientalist myths, not least among them the view of Arab and Muslim women as passive victims. These myths are having a hard time explaining the active participation of Arab women, religious and secular, liberals and socialists, working class and middle class, across the Arab world in these massive demonstrations calling for democracy and the overthrow of the US-supported dictatorships. This must be emphasized every day in our analysis of these revolutions, but most of all today, which happens to be International Women's Day. Our guest this evening is one of those millions of women who are participating in these revolutionary efforts. These developments would have delighted Edward Said to no end. Egypt is, of course, where Edward Said grew up and to which he returned many times in the last decade of his life. I spent last fall and part of the winter there, returning to New York only 2 weeks before the revolution started, which saddened me to no end. Coincidentally, the apartment I rented was opposite the building where Edward grew up on Aziz Osman Street, overlooking the aquarium in Zamalek. Zamalek is also the neighborhood where our speaker, Dr. Ahdaf Soueif, grew up. In contrast to Arab novelists writing in French, such as Katib Yassin, Asya Jabbar, Tahir Ben Jalloun, Abdul Kabir al-Khatibi, Amin Ma'louf, to name a few, there have only been a few Arabs who wrote poetry or novels in English, and fewer yet who could make a name for themselves in the English-speaking world. This brief and short list, however, has had a longer history than might appear at first sight. It was perhaps inaugurated by the Lebanese Gibran Khalil Gibran, whose success in making a name for himself in the West and in the Arab world was unprecedented. Few since even attempted this difficult task. Palestinian writer Jabra Ibrahim Jabra's Hunters in a Narrow Street, Egyptian writer Wagih Ghali's posthumously published Beer in the Snooker Club, Lebanese writer Etal Adnan's Sit Marie Rose, or Palestinian writer Fawaz Turki's The Disinherited are some such attempts, although Ghali's novel stands out in a class of its own. Ahdaf Soueif's name joined this literary list in 1983 with the publication of her first book of short stories, Aisha. She would emerge as one of the most talented contemporary novelists in English in 1992 with the publication of her brilliant first novel, In the Eye of the Sun, which launched her on the international scene. Critical acclaim poured in on this novel from every possible corner of the English and Arabic-speaking worlds. Soueif followed with a second book of short stories in 1996. Her second novel, Map of Love, which would become a bestseller, was published in 1999 and was shortlisted for the Booker Prize the same year. It was translated to 20 languages. Soueif, who holds a PhD in linguistics, is perhaps the first Arab writer in English fiction since Gibran to achieve such international recognition. Soueif's writings investigate the possibilities of cultural dialogue, as well as the politics of desire, both within and outside this dialogue. Desire in Soueif's work always exists in a context of politics, history, and geography, all of which are intermeshed and cannot be disentangled. She works through this intricate web, tirelessly portraying the difficulty and ease of negotiating desire on such dangerous terrain. Central to her investigations is the encounter of East and West, of Arabic and English, and of men and women in an intercultural context. Soueif explores the lives of middle-class and poor Egyptian women, Muslim, Christian, Arab, and Greek, as well as the lives of foreign expatriates, American, Canadian, English, Turkish, black, and white. These characters and their psychologies emerge as the effects of all that surrounds them: culture, domestic and international politics, economics, society, family, and above all, desire and love. Everything about them is overdetermined in intricate and simple ways and rendered in a prose of high aesthetic quality. If Arab male novelists have transported their Arab male characters to Europe in their exploration of East and West, and here I have in mind not only Tayyib Saleh's much celebrated The Season of Migration to the North, but also Tawfiq al-Hakim's Wasfur min al-Sharq, or Bird from the East, Yahya Haqqi's Qandil Hashim, or Hashim's Lamp, and Baha Tahir's Bil Amsi Halimtu Bika, I Dreamt of You Last Night. Soueif, unlike much of the Arabic literary genre within which she's writing, transports her main female characters from the Arab world to Europe and back. Soueif's aim is to cut through the confusion and stereotypes of society, the dissimulation of international, national, and family politics, and the secure matrix through which life and its desires are defined. The journey of her characters is not one where liberation is the necessary telos, but rather the complex process through which the unfolding of desires, sexual, social, economic, and political, is shaped by the characters themselves and all that surrounds them. Dr. Soueif is also a political and cultural commentator, a veritable public intellectual. A collection of her essays, Mezza Terra, Fragments from the Common Ground, was published in 2004. She is also a translator in her own right. Her translation from Arabic into English of the memoir of the Palestinian poet Mourid Barghouti, I Saw Ramallah, also came out in 2004. Soueif occupies a very interesting position among contemporary writers, Egyptian and British. Writing in both English and Arabic, concerned with both the art of fiction and the state of the world, she works at several crossroads. She contributes regularly to The Guardian in the United Kingdom and has a column in the Egyptian Ash-Shuruq. In 2007, she founded Engaged Events, a United Kingdom-based charity whose first project was the Palestine Festival of Literature, which since then has taken place annually in Al-Quds, in Bethlehem, in Nablus, Ramallah, Jenin, and Al-Khalil. In May 2010, she became the first recipient of the newly established Mahmoud Darwish Award. Edward Said described Soueif, and I quote him, as one of the most extraordinary chroniclers of sexual politics now writing. I would add that Soueif's novels have also chronicled and documented the emotional and political life of the Arab world in the 20th century. I met Ahdaf in 1999 while preparing an essay about her literary output. I conducted an interview with her, which I published along with my essay. We became close friends and allies instantly. We certainly could not have chosen a better chronicler of the ongoing Egyptian revolution than Ahdaf Soueif. Let me conclude by saying that this is not the first time Ahdaf and I shared a podium at Columbia University. Edward Said had invited us in October 2000 to have a discussion on her literary work, which we successfully held in Shapiro Hall, very close by. Tonight, Dr. Soueif is at Columbia once again. She will share with us her notes from the Egyptian Revolution. Please help me give her a very warm welcome.
Thank you very much. Well, if I get less applause when I finish, I will know that this was for the Egyptian Revolution, not for me. I must say, when it was proposed that my very dear friend Joseph Mas'ad do my introduction, I thought he would just say, here's Ahdaf Soueif. I should have known better. I should have known better. Sorry, it was a joke. I won't repeat it.
It was a good joke.
Okay, well, I've been used to large numbers of people in Tahrir Square, but I was not expecting you all here tonight. But you are very welcome, and I'm glad to see you. I'm tremendously honored to have been invited to give. This would be better if it were a little lower down. Can it go lower down? It's kind of. I'm shorter than. 10. Oh, point this down like this? Okay. Is this kind of better? Is this okay? Thank you. Okay. So I'm enormously honored to have been invited to give the Edward Said Memorial Lecture at Columbia this year. And I would like to start by genuinely and formally thanking Columbia University and the Edward Said Lecture Committee for inviting me, and also thanking the Heyman Center and the Middle East Institute for sponsoring this event. I also thank Joseph for introducing me, and thank you all for being here tonight. I'm also really touched to be here, and at this moment, fresh out of the Egyptian Revolution, to speak in this gathering and to speak in the presence of my very good friend Mariam Said and Edward's children, Najla and Waldia, and Edward's sister Grace, and all the people here who would have been friends of Edward. The last time I was on the Columbia campus, apart from yesterday, was with Edward. And we walked through the campus on our way to have lunch, and our progress was very slow because he had to keep stopping and talking to people, of course. And I'm sure that many of those people will probably be here today. Yesterday, I also had the privilege of being there at the inauguration of the Edward Said Reading Room in the Butler Library, and it was wonderful to be there, and it was wonderful to listen to the short and eloquent and heartfelt speeches given by people which demonstrated, if we were still in need of demonstrations, how Edward's words live and how his legacy lives and how his thought is still very relevant and very much of the moment today. I have, as I'm sure many, many thousands of people have, missed his voice a great deal in the 7.5 years since his departure. And I've missed his argument, his advocacy, and very, very much his will to optimism. There have been many events in the world during those 7.5 years where we sorely needed his voice. I'm sure many of them will cross your minds, the bombardment of Gaza being perhaps foremost among them. But on the other hand, there was also a sense that he had been spared a lot of what we have seen over the last 7.5 years. The increasing brutality, the increasing polarization, the increasing degradation, if you like, of public discourse. It's a different kind of missing him that I feel now with the advent of the Egyptian revolution, because this was a moment that he would have cherished. This is something that would have made him happy. This is something that vindicates Edward's will to optimism. Certainly for the first 2 weeks during the revolution, I was constantly seized with the urge to talk to him and to talk to my mother, both of whom, of course, I can no longer talk to. But it was like I thought I would speak to them and then realized that I couldn't, over and over again. But I can hear his voice over the phone. I can hear his voice torn between the absolute desire and urge to be in Tahrir Square and the knowledge that his doctor would definitely advise him not to mix with crowds. Talk about crowds. He would have wanted to know all the details. I mean, Edward was like, if you were having a sandwich, he would ask you if there was a gherkin in it. He would have been checking the account that you gave him with accounts that other people had given him, cross-checking. He would have been loving the jokes and telling you the ones that you had not heard and asking about favorite villains and friends. It would have been very easy to talk to Edward because that would have been an ongoing conversation. It would have been updates and details and anecdotes and jokes. It's not really so easy to know what to say here tonight. So this was my excuse preamble, because here tonight it's kind of necessary to step back slightly in order to give some kind of overall account of what is going on. I'm sure you know that I was supposed to talk about something completely different. But then the 25th of January happened, and of course I was told that nobody wanted to hear about anything except this, and in truth, it would be very difficult for me to talk about anything else. But this is an event that is still in process. This is an event, I mean, I am so immersed in it, as indeed so many of us are, that it's quite strange sometimes to look around and realize that one is not in Egypt. What you are going to get this evening is, as the poster says, don't say you weren't told, this is notes, observations, notes on the Egyptian revolution. This is not something sort of thought out or coherent, and certainly not scholarly. And I find myself, as I talk about it, and friends here will testify to this, that I kind of quite quickly start to sound almost mystical, you know, like having visions. But the thing is, of course, that it is a near miraculous event. First, because it happened at all. We have been waiting for it for so long. The Arab world has been waiting for it for so long, and we as individuals have been waiting for it for so long. And here I'm just going to digress slightly and complain about what it has been like to be an Egyptian abroad for many years now. So, for example, in Palestine, in El Khalil, under the most dreadful circumstances, an elderly man offers me a gift from his shop. This is like the one guy who still has a shop open. And he's offering me a gift from the shop because I'm Egyptian. And, it's so embarrassing because it's so long since Egypt has done anything for the Palestinians except sell them down the river repeatedly, And I say this, and he says, no, you're still the beating heart of Arabhood and Abdel Nasser, and, inshallah, your day will come back, Well, here we are. So... Yeah, but seriously, I mean, in Spain, I sort of like the look of a bowl in a shop window, and I go in, and they turn out to be Moroccan, and where are you from? I'm from Egypt. Well, shame on you. How come you've got bread queues? Didn't you used to feed the world? How can the Arab world move if Egypt doesn't move? And you stand there. And what can you say? It's true, So... we've been waiting for it, and we've been saying it's simmering, it's boiling, it can't go on like this. But of course, then there are the voices that popular revolutions can't happen anymore, their day has passed, there's something, etc. But the other miraculous thing, of course, is the nature of this revolution. What you can describe as its personality, what it's been like, this thing that has happened. And it's that really that I want to talk about, and that I think is so fitting to talk about in the context of the Edward Said Memorial Lecture, because I feel that there are so many aspects of the personality of this revolution that would have resonated so well with Edward, that actually exemplify Edward's ideas, his way of being, and what he stood for and what he taught us. And I think just as a useful way to look at it, when I look at the characteristics that define our revolution, it's interesting to look at them side by side with the characteristics or the appropriate characteristics that define what is not the revolution, what the revolution was against. So, to start with, of course, the revolution was against the authority of the regime, against also the authoritarianism of the regime, to put it politely, of course, that's more than authoritarianism. And it pitted itself against authority, and it succeeded, but also it is insisting on not turning into an authority itself. And this is a very interesting process and experiment that is taking place right now, in that there is a resistance among the people who are taking part in the revolution. I don't know what to call us, as it were, the revolutionaries, the what, and I don't want to say the shabab, because now it is much more than shabab, than the youth. It is in fact the whole people. But there is an insistence on the horizontal nature of the revolution. There is even a resistance to appointing a spokesperson from among the youth, so that at the moment we have so many people speaking for the revolution, which is correct, but can it continue in this way? There is a resistance to setting up parties. We have parties that are remnants of the pre-25th of January, whether they are discredited parties that ought to be disbanded immediately, like the National Democratic Party, and that will, inshallah, be disbanded soon, or whether they are, just really parties that have not managed to do anything very much. But the idea of creating new parties born of the revolution, even though it is bruited and put about, has not so far taken purchase. And there is one of the very interesting ideas being discussed is, do we need parties? In other words, shouldn't we now be in a position where we do not automatically follow models that have been proved not to work particularly well? And so, is it the case that the party political system is a comfortable fit with Egyptian society? Or should we be looking at our society and working out which structures it might more comfortably fall into, which can become the political structures that we work with? Is this idealistic? Do we have the time to work this out? And these are all questions that are being put about. But this also means that this revolution is tremendously inventive and tremendously creative. Actually, let me just go back. I think it doesn't need saying how authoritarian the regime was and how it could not help but be authoritarian. I mean, the most that the regime could do to put a kind of new face when it started realizing that authoritarianism and paternalism and so on were not the most popular features right now, was for the top people to take off their suits. And so we had a PR company, and I think it was even said which PR company it was, telling them to get out of white shirts and put on blue ones, to turn up their sleeves, to take off their suit jackets. So this was them relinquishing authority. Okay, so inventiveness. Now, at every level, from the level of the chants that were immediately appearing on the street. Something would happen, and a rhythmic and rhymed chant would go up to greet it and to respond to it. To the slogans on the banners, the sort of bits of cardboard that people were carrying. To, I'm sure many of you have seen the images of people sitting around lampposts with the wires coming out, having plugged in their laptops and their mobiles, and using to basically, if you have 1 million people somewhere, you're going to need bathrooms. And so to the creation of bathrooms and systems for people to use the bathrooms, the inventiveness was amazing, has been amazing. We've had street art, we've had stand-up comics. In the middle of the tear gas, actually on the first day that I was there, the 28th of January, when trying to get across the 6th of October bridge to join the revolution in Tahrir, and there was the smoke, the tear gas, and you could see flames, and people were kind of covering their faces. And there was one guy, and this is the first one of the kind that I saw. There's one guy standing on the island in the middle of the bridge, and he had a brown paper bag over his head, and he'd cut 2 holes, and he had a great big question mark down the nose, and he was just standing doing that. He was sort of, it was street theater in the middle of the tear gas, and this went on, and it was any occasion for a joke. So when we had the Baltageya, with the stones and all the rest of it, and people started having to wear crash helmets, and not everybody has access to crash helmets, and people were wearing saucepans on their heads. And of course, there is a trope in Egyptian comedy, which is that if you're mad, you wear a saucepan on you. That's, if a character walks on stage in a farce and he's wearing a saucepan on his head, that means he's nuts. He's mad. And so suddenly the square is full of people wearing saucepans on their head and having a great joke about it. So the sheer inventiveness and creativity, it was like sort of a lid had been lifted and everybody was doing stuff. Now, compare that to the performance of the regime, which turned out, every trick that it had used over the last 30 years was rehearsed again, possibly in a duller way than ever before. Sometimes in the wrong order, if they wanted to be effective. So, for example, there was the night when Mr. Mubarak gave his speech, that was a Tuesday, and he came up and he gave a very kind of slow and ponderous speech about how he had served his country in peace and in war. and ended with how he was and how he was not going to stay beyond September. I mean, how can you do that? How can you? People are saying, go away, and he says, well, I'll just stay till September. So anyway, so he said, I'm not going to stay beyond September, and there will be no hereditary blah, his son wouldn't, and so on. And I am an old man, and I need to die in my country. Okay, now, there was, of course, because we are a good people, and we are a people with heart, so there was a sizable proportion of people, even revolutionaries, who started saying, well, you know what, he is an old man. He is an old man, and if he's going away in September, well, what's the harm? Let him just stay till September. The guy, he was an Air Force pilot, he just wants to die here. Now, so basically, your heart is sinking. I mean, many of us, our hearts are sinking, and we think, sort of very popular broadcasters are weeping on television and saying, oh, I'm really moved. He only wants to die here. And so, and you're thinking, well, he might actually have swung them. He might have swung them. And then next morning, there's all the noise of the klaxons, and you're thinking, what is this? This can't be our people, because we've really been very polite and quiet, and we haven't used our horns, because it's not nice to use your horns, and so on. So, and of course, it turns out it's them. It's the counter-revolution. And we're worried. Except that the next thing is, of course, that they send the camels and the horses into Tahrir, and then at night they send the Baltagiya. I don't know, you must know this word by now, and you loosely translate it as thugs or the paramilitaries or the thug militias. They send them, and backed by security. So basically you've got the lines of the thugs who are in plain clothes, and they're supposed to be Mubarak supporters who've just come out all on their own, with their bags of stones. Yeah? But behind them, there are the central security, the police trucks, just driving up and down behind them, supplying them with weapons. And you're supposed not to see those. They're kind of behind an invisible screen that you're not meant to be aware of. And basically, he just loses the sympathy of the country. I just wonder what would have happened if he hadn't done that day, if he just let people mull over this kind of weepy, tearful speech. And not come down with the Baltagiya, what might have happened. So there they were, sort of rehearsing their old, tired procedures. The revolution was peaceable. You will all have heard the cry, Silmiya, Silmiya. That was peaceable, peaceable. And that just was a constant refrain, a constant affirmation that this was a peaceable revolution. On the first day, which was the day that actually the Central Security Forces and the police were trying to kettle the first demonstrators. I don't know if you have the word kettle here. This is from dealing with the police in Britain, actually, who kettle you. They kettle the protesters, which means to sort of encircle them and squeeze, so that you're being confined to a smaller and smaller space. So when the security and police in Egypt were kettling the first lot of protesters and trying actually to push them towards the American embassy to create an incident, and the cry was Silmiya, Silmiya, constantly. And of course, it's needless to say that the regime was, totally the opposite of Silmiya. And I will say also that even though the cry was Silmiya, and even though that was the banner of the revolution, when we were attacked, we fought back. So this was not, as kind of lying down or turning. It fought back, and they fought back well. And this was one of, actually, to me, it was just so impressive how, with no preparation, with no manual, with no training, people in Tahrir Square, on the night of the Wednesday, what was it, the 2nd of February? Friday was the 28th of January, whatever the Wednesday was, when the thugs and the camels and so on came down. And there were the battles. And people fell into battle formation. if any of you are familiar with Tahrir Square, there's the entrance to the square that is flanked on the one side by the Egyptian Museum and on the other side by the Franciscan School. And across that entrance, or just beyond it, there's the flyover of 6th of October Bridge. So that's a high ground that people can use to attack into the square. And at that entrance, that was where the major Wednesday battle for Tahrir happened. And suddenly you had a defense line 3 deep of young men who, and in front of them, they placed burnt out cars, and they were the ones who were in charge of throwing stones back at the attackers. And because they had these cars in front of them to protect them, they couldn't see where their attackers were coming from. And so they were getting signals from people further back, but standing high up, who'd say right and left. And these people could be men or women. So it would be right, and everybody would throw the stones to the right. Left, it would throw the stones to the left. You know, beyond that line of 3, there was a line that was there in order to provide a second line of defense should that first line fall. And beyond that, the third line was the reservists who were constantly swapping with the ones in front. Now, that happened. Obviously, the stones that were being thrown at them, they were picking them up and throwing them back, but also they were getting fresh supplies. And those supplies were coming from older people who were sitting way back in the square, breaking up the pavement. Breaking up the pavement, and then the stones would be run to the front on blankets, that would sort of carry the stones to the front and distribute them. In one corner, a field hospital was created, and that was mostly women because the men were fighting. So that was the nurses and the doctors were mostly women. And somehow they found helmets. They didn't have to wear saucepans. Somehow they found helmets for them, so they were there, and the sort of medicines and bandages and so on were rushed to them. One truck had a group of 7 or 8 young men on them carrying the flag, and the flag never stopped waving. And then there were the people who were in charge of keeping up morale, who basically, they took down the sort of corrugated tin hoardings that were concealing the building works on the metro or whatever it is that the government has been building there for 15 years, which we don't know what it is, but it's been behind that corrugated metal for all these years, and they took down the panels, and they were just beating the panels. For 8 hours, that drumming on the panels did not stop. And that kept everybody... I mean, it was just amazing, and it just happened. And this is a complete... it's one of the examples of the transformation that happened to people in that suddenly, because of the enablement, the empowerment, the sense of agency that they felt, because they were acting communally, everybody became part of a unit, and everybody became part of an organic unit and knew what their role was, knew where it was that they could place themselves and what they could do to be most effective, and were doing it to the absolute best of their ability. And we saw that. You will have seen the pictures of the people sweeping the streets, of people painting the pavements, of people, bringing in food. Just that sense of being an important part of a communal effort. Self-initiating, self-starting, but with so much riding on what you did was incredible. Sorry. So, at the same time, the revolution was law-abiding and decent. Any thug who was captured was checked out, their IDs were checked, they were very often found to belong to the security services, to the police, but without uniform. They were handed over to the army. Nobody was brutalized, nobody was beaten. Nothing happened to anyone. The official security services, not the Baltagaya, but the Central Security Police, even though they are widely hated, even though 2 minutes ago they had been beating you, if they surrendered, they were allowed to go. They were basically, they were even allowed to keep their weapon. Their weapon was emptied, because if they didn't have their weapon, they would be court-martialed or killed or whatever it is the regime would have done to them. So their weapon was emptied and they were allowed to leave. So law-abiding and decent. Again, compare that to the behavior of the regime, not just during the revolution, but over the last 30 years, and particularly in the last 10 years, when anybody in Egypt was constantly at risk of being dragged off the street, humiliated, tortured, beaten up, dumped on some desert road, upon any pretext whatsoever. And this was constantly happening, and it was spreading. Inclusive, again, the sense that people had of having broken out of some horrible isolationist nightmare, where the policy of the regime had been to divide and to scare people of each other. So it was turn Christian against Muslim and Muslim against Christian, turn the rich against the poor. They even the discourse at the beginning of the revolution, or on sort of day 2 or 3 of the revolution, was, we know that you are honorable people and that you have the interests of the country at heart, but you have been infiltrated. Now, who have we been infiltrated by? Well, by the slum dwellers, So you're okay, you're kind of middle class and fine, but you know what? Poor people are coming among you, and so you'd better take care. Well, hang on, this is a revolution, It's kind of not a tea party, a bridge party, not tea party, excuse me, bridge party. So that whole divisive thing, if you're secular, they'll frighten you of the Islamists, You get rid of us and the Muslims will come and they will institute Sharia law and they will make you all put veils on, and then if you're an Islamist, look, there are the infidels, there are the communists, there are the people, you know what they're doing in Tahrir? They've got girls and boys sleeping together in the same tent, It was just pathetic, and it had been going on for so long, and people broke out of it and articulated the fact that they were breaking out of it. Actually, a great communication was going on and continues to go on. But you would be just standing or walking in the square and somebody would just start talking to you. And people were articulating what they were feeling and what they were learning and communicating it to each other. This is kind of an aside, but it's an idea that I had been following in a novel which my beloved publisher and editor is here, and anyway, we're going to talk about what happens to this book. But basically, in about 200 years before 2000 BC, the Old Kingdom in Egypt fell. The Old Kingdom is where all the pyramids were built, for example. And it collapsed. And there followed 200 years of tremendous decline and fragmentation. And actually what was said at that point was that this is the end of history. Nothing is new, really, is it? So as far as people were concerned, then Egypt was the world. And so this was the end of the world, and it was the end of history. Because everything that we valued, everything that we believed in had been proved not to work. And, brother had turned against brother, a parent had abandoned child, our tombs had been ransacked, etc., etc. Now, the most common refrain from the literary complaints that come down to us from this period is, who can I speak to today? And that really is very telling. This idea that having no one to speak to is like the most terrible thing that can happen to you. And when you say speak, you assume that the person that you are speaking to is attentive. They're not passively listening. They're not waiting for you to finish. They are actively listening and engaging and working out what they can do, what they can contribute. And so in Tahrir Square, people were talking to each other and listening to each other in that spirit. And this is actually, again, another little aside, but it's not so much aside, is that this was one of the great qualities. I mean, I'm sure as I've been listing the qualities of the revolution, Edward has not been far from any of our minds. But this positive engagement, this listening to you, and then so you say to him, oh, I'm going to be in Rome next week. And you arrive in Rome and somebody phones you and says, I'm so-and-so, I was a student of Edward's and he said you were coming here and I was to show you round, the city. Or he'll say to you, oh, you're going to Rome, well, could you go and check on my old music teacher? His old music teacher taught him music when he was 12, And he's still sending you to check on her because you're going to be in that. So that sort of, anyway, positive engagement. So this communication, again, and inclusiveness and willingness to learn and communality. Again, I've touched on that everybody was feeling themselves to be part of something that was bigger than themselves. And everybody was risking something to be there. And everybody was trying to bring something to the situation, to bring something to Tahrir. And I use Tahrir as a shorthand because if anybody is here who was somewhere other than Tahrir, we're not being chauvinist. Tahrir really has just become the symbol for every place in Egypt where the revolution was happening. And, I mean, there are other sort of adjectives that one could use, but the last one that I'm going to talk about, because I really would also like this to be a conversation somehow, is that it was modern. Now, we all know that the important role that the media, the new, what is it called? New media, new social, what? Yeah, exactly, fine. Anyway, Twitter. You know what I mean, Twitter and Facebook and SMSs and all that, the role that they played in the revolution. So this was a revolution that was cutting edge, that was modern and of the minute, and it was very aware of itself as such. And I hadn't realized, but I was told by my son and nieces, nephew, who were all part of the revolution, that part of what they felt and part of what people felt particularly when the camel was turned loose on them on that Wednesday, was that they felt insulted. They felt insulted in terms of Orientalism, Truly. I mean, basically, it was that everybody was very aware of the issue of image. And it was expressed to me that this is a measure of how far Edward's ideas have permeated the street, have permeated people's consciousness, and that everybody is aware of this issue of image. Everybody is aware of the attempt, which Joseph, of course, spoke of earlier, to paint us in a particular way, as being not ready for democracy, as being prone to extremism, as being prone to hysteria, as being fanatical, as being violent, and so on, and then to attack us with camels was, and it wasn't only camels, they had swords, They had swords and they had whips, and they had, it was just medieval. And people were saying, they have said this and that about us, and I am really not talking about the intellectuals, the intelligentsia. This was the man on the street. This was the guy who sells sweet corn. They were saying they have been telling the world that we're not ready for democracy. They've been telling the world, we know these people. It's a matter of the price of bread. But this is about dignity. This is about freedom. And they were very keen that the world would know this. So basically, it really did feel that here was a young, vigorous, very open, inclusive, connected up to the international scene movement, which was being, held, or they didn't hold it, but the regime that was trying to oppose it and to contain it and to hold it back was Neanderthal, was a dinosaur, was so heavy that it just couldn't be flexible, it couldn't maneuver, it just kept doing the same old thing. It was like some sort of jerky sort of 40s monster in a movie. It kept bringing out the same tired things, and was just unable to adapt. And when a businessman, a major businessman who dyes his hair deep red, as all our government did, really, apart from the ladies who dyed it blonde, but anyway, and who is so close to the National Democratic Party and to the government, he pays the camel right. It was those guys who sort of hire out camels near the pyramids. And Mr. Abu Al-Ainin, who kind of has some kind of clout in that community, goes and pays them to come riding into Tahrir Square. And I happened to not be in the square, but I saw it on television, so I called my sister, who of course was in the thick of it, and I said, "What is this? I see horses and camels." She said, no, it's fine, we've captured them all, we've even ridden them. And later on, somebody also said, when we said, "Oh, how amazing, how did you capture those horses?" And he said, "Well, actually it was quite easy because they came galloping in on the asphalt and they're not meant to gallop on asphalt, so they were sort of sliding it's just comic if it weren't so... So really, this really just takes me to the total conviction, not mine alone, but anybody who's read Edward's work has seen it reflected, as they said to me, intellectually and physically. It was the ideas to do with the necessity of controlling your image with the modern versus with what that part of the world says about you. There was a day when Omar Suleiman, who was supposed to be, they were trying to slide him in as sort of, vice president, he's going to be the next president, and that would be fine, and so on. And he spoke to Christiana Mampour. And slightly later on, there was a speech by Ehud Barak, and I swear it was like they were looking at the same piece of paper in what they said about the Egyptian revolution and the Arab world and what people were ready and were not ready for. They were singing from the same songbook. So basically, as I was saying, this miraculous and humanist and inclusive and modern revolution, I think, and many of us think, exemplifies much of what Edward has been writing and speaking about. The last time I saw Edward, actually, was at Hay on Wye, and it was the summer before we lost him, he had an event at Hay. Hay on Wye is the big literary festival in England. And he had an event, and I had an event, and I went down there, and he was staying with Karl Sabbar. And at one point in the discussion, he burst out very irately, and he said, how come it's all talk of geopolitics? How come nobody talks about the big things anymore? Where are the concepts of justice and liberty? And a deep silence fell upon the all, because it was completely true that the discourse had fallen to such a level that it was as if those words were somehow faintly embarrassing. And he brought them up, and he said to me he had very sweetly attended my event, and he said to me as we walked out that he found my performance very touching in the belief and optimism that I showed. And from anyone else, I would have felt patronized. But with him, I really didn't, because I knew that he meant it seriously. And I knew that he was speaking literally, and that to be touched was a good thing. So I am very touched and very happy and very kind of not fearful, but I kind of feel that I kind of want to hold this thing that's happening. I think many of us feel like this, that you just want to keep concentrating on it, you want to hold it, you want to keep it safe, you want to just make sure that it sort of stays okay. And so now the people in Egypt, young and old, are chanting, are discussing, are articulating these big concepts that Edward was so annoyed on that last day were not being spoken about. So we have عيش, حرية, عدالة اجتماعية, bread, liberty, and social justice. Many of us on the streets have said, if only Edward Said were here to see this, that would have been a really great moment. This is his moment of victory, and it's the victory that he was so fond of quoting Aimé Césaire as describing in its inclusiveness. There is room for all, and there certainly is room for all in Egypt, because we really feel, I mean, we're talking about Egypt and the Egyptian revolution, and is it popular, is it societal, is it human? And I just want to say that the feeling that we all have there is that, okay, we're very, very proud, and I'm sure you can imagine, having just been, feeling so awful about ourselves for so long, it's wonderful to be able to feel proud again of being Egyptian. And the cry that went up in the square when Mubarak left was, "Hold your head up high, you're Egyptian." But at the same time, we became very aware of the interest that the world was showing in this revolution, of the way it had captured people's imagination, the way it had spoken to people, and the energy that came back to us from that reception that it was having in the world was tremendously important. And our sense is that this is something unique, this is something that was very necessary to happen, that it's still there as sort of like a newborn thing, that we still have to sort of nurture it and see how it'll grow, and that it's Egyptian in that it happened to be born in Egypt, but it really belongs to the world, to everybody. So, thank you.
Thank you, Ahdaf, for this wonderful presentation of your own participation in the revolution and what's been unfolding in Egypt and across the Arab world. Certainly what started in Tunisia has now reached at least over a dozen, maybe 16 Arab capitals ongoing. Ahdaf will take questions, and I think there seems to be microphones in the middle. Should you like to line up and take questions? So please.
I have a critical question. I can understand this euphoria. A wind of change is blowing from Morocco all the way to Iraq and Iran. And looking at the images of at Al Jazeera on Al Tahrir, I can imagine that people are in a euphoric state. But Obama and others were quickly, they wanted to have a controlled transition. And you mentioned that they planted first Suleiman, and that is significant. Suleiman was quickly replaced by the military. And the military, so what we had in fact is a military coup. So what happened is that the counter-revolution prevailed and the revolution has been derailed at this moment. So the euphoria, I do not understand. And if you listen to the presentation of Mullen, Gates and so on, Robert Gates of Defense, they were saying, because they are financing the military apparatus in Egypt, they were saying and sending the warnings to the army. We are going to watch very carefully who is acting in what way. Mubarak needed to be replaced because he could not continue. But so everyone understood that. So they threw a bone to the revolution. The revolution, my thesis is, and you can read it in scattered places. The revolution has been. There was a coup, an American coup, supported by their henchmen, the military in Egypt.
Respond now?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. Right. Okay. Well, I mean, I think of course, overall, I understand what you're saying. I understand your concern. Nobody expects the powers with big interests to be sitting on their hands and doing nothing, clearly. However, in your detail, it's not quite correct. So Omar Suleiman was placed in position by Mubarak as vice president. Now, of course, you could argue that the Americans or the Israelis had pressured Mubarak to name Omar Suleiman as his vice president, and it certainly was said very clearly, and it was said by the Israelis openly, and I don't know why they did that they were the one person in Egypt that they were happy to succeed Mubarak was Omar Suleiman. Now, you know, if they didn't want to scupper his chances, I don't understand why they sort of came out with that. But anyway, but we have not ended up with Omar Suleiman. I mean, Omar Suleiman left with Mubarak, or, you know, it was out of power with Mubarak, and we were left with the cabinet of Ahmed Shafi and with the military as a holding council. And now we have got rid of the cabinet of Ahmed Shafi, and we actually have a cabinet that is born of the revolution. The military are still holding, in effect, the position of president, but our reading of them is that they don't want it, that they actually are waiting to return to barracks, that they would like to hand the country over. The military, of course, has its own interests. It has its share of the GDP. It has its own divisions within the military. These are all things that are balancing out, that are playing out. You know, we'll see what happens. It's been very clear that the people have been very aware of the dangers of the military, and they have co-opted them. The moment the tanks and the armored vehicles appeared on the streets, the people surrounded them, embraced them, climbed over them, slept on the tracks, threw their babies at them, everything. Engaged them in conversation, so that the soldiers and the officers on the ground were saying, if we get orders to shoot you, we won't do it. You know, there is a dialectic going on, and nobody can predict how it's going to turn out. We do not imagine that the world is sitting by and letting us do our own thing and, you know, everything is rosy. No, it isn't. We know that we are potentially harming very, very big interests. But we also know that on the 20th of January, if you had said to anybody in the world, including in Egypt, that the Egyptian revolution would happen and that we would get rid of Hosni Mubarak and that we would have a cabinet right now of people, of technocrats, of officials that the people approve of, that our people, our young people, would be inside the dreaded state security intelligence services, leafing through the files and phoning us and saying, hey, you know, I found your file. Yeah? Who would have believed it? The world is full of potential and possibility, and there is no point. There is no point in being anything other than optimistic. There really isn't, because, okay, otherwise you might as well just, go and hand yourself over, here, come on, handcuff me, torture me, So you might as well be optimistic while being alert and being inventive and being flexible. We always have a proverb. I will be Orientalist, Arab, whatever, and I will say we have a proverb in Egypt that says, حرص وما تخونش. So basically, don't assume that anybody's going to betray you, but be careful, Be friendly, but be vigilant. That's what we're doing. So, shall we take somebody from over here?
Thank you very much for sharing these notes with us. I lived the momentous events in my country, Tunisia, vicarious.
Thank you.
These events in my country, as I'm sure in Egypt, had a woman's face all over it. Either these young girls and students with their brothers in the front line, or the grieving mothers who lost dear ones and came back and joined the front line. And it has been for my country, as I would imagine for Egypt, a momentous, empowering opportunity for young women. And there is a concern that now the change of regime has taken place, women are not there or permitted or further empowered or given a space to shape the future. For example, the cabinet, the third one in Tunisia, 22 ministers, only 2 women. And yet we pride ourselves of being avant-gardists when it comes to gender equality and women empowerment. If I am properly informed, the reform constitution in Egypt has no woman on it, the same in Tunisia. And what I'd like to hear from you, how can these important characteristics in your notes, those adjectives, can be further mobilized to ensure that women continue to have a voice in shaping the future for Egypt and Tunisia and the others. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. If I could just pick up on the detail of this constitutional thing in Egypt. Basically what has happened is that the army has, with advice, appointed a small constitutional committee to amend the constitution. And we have a problem with the constitution in that it has been so mutilated by the government that it will not permit us, it will not deliver free and fair elections. So for elections to happen, certain articles in the constitution have to be amended so as to allow free and fair elections. So we have 2 issues. One is amending those specific articles so we can have elections, and the other is the larger one of rethinking the constitution, and the general bent is towards readopting the constitutions of 1923 and 1954 while bringing them up to date. And then there were, again, 2 ideas. One was, do we have a quick fix so that we can have elections and then there can be a proper rethinking of the constitution, or do we hold everything and have 2 months of people actually rewriting the constitution and then have... And so what has happened is the former, that basically a small committee was put in place to fix those specific articles. Now that committee, there have been various objections to it. 1, that it was put in place by the military. 2, that it didn't have any women. 3, that it was only 8 people instead of the 40 that you, etc. But fortunately, all it has done is amend the particular articles that enable you to have an election. And the idea is that very soon there would be a founding committee of the new constitution, which would be at least 40 people, figures from all over, the sort of public spectrum of Egypt, as well as constitutional experts, and that there will be a national debate on the actual constitution that the country agrees to live by. And there is no doubt that there will be women on that. I think that for the moment, the position of women in Egypt, the position of the feminist societies, the position of the women's NGOs, which they have declared and they have published, is that this is a revolution about citizenship, about politics, about the economy. This is not about gender. That essentially gender issues are part of what is being resolved, like, you know, in the general progress of things. But this revolution, the women have declared themselves as citizens, equal citizens, participating in the revolution, but it is not gender issues that are being raised now. But everybody is completely aware of the necessity, and to be frank, not just women, but the necessity to include Christians, for example, that every one of the institutions that will be put in place will have to have proper representation. We want women, we want Christians, we want young people, we want people from the rural districts, we want to devolve decision-making as much as possible to local level, you know, big things. But it just, you know, I mean, we've got to get a proper cabinet in place, we've got all sorts of things to do without sort of dividing ourselves right now. Maybe what we should do is take several comments and questions in one go, and then otherwise, you know, you're going to be here till tomorrow. Please, go ahead.
I have to follow up on the previous fellow's counter-revolution, because there have been some very disturbing events. There have been some very disturbing events in Egypt. Today, the Million Women March, the women were attacked by Baltagayas, which, and as you recall, when the state security building was attacked or captured or whatever you want to call it, there were also other police attacking the people, which means that the 500,000 state security services are still operating, and obviously they're being coordinated by someone. And where's Mr. Suleiman? The next question is, Amr Moussa announced his presidential candidacy right after Mr. Lieberman, friend of the Arabs, visited Tahrir Square with Mr. McCain. So is there a counter-revolution occurring to bring a false opposition that will split the revolutionaries? Are they aware of this? Do we need a purge of the security services? And I mean a purge. This is only Act 1, apparently. When I say a purge, where are all the people who were, Habib al-Adli, for instance? He's been
arrested, actually.
Accused of, well,
he's in jail
money
at the
laundering.
moment.
Money laundering, but not murder.
No, but
So those are important issues.
Yeah.
Robert Fisk, he wrote in The Independent that the military had given orders to create a massacre, as we know. Those orders were disobeyed by the local commanders on the ground. However, that order came from the military, Tantawi. He's still in power. He is the power. So the people who gave an order for a massacre are now holding all the cards. How do we wrest that away? Are the people aware of that? And the final question is, when will Najla Saeed come and give a performance of her play at her father's university?
Okay.
It was a superb play.
Where is
Thank you,
Najla?
Dr. Masoud.
Do you want to answer that one?
I was invited, but they never followed up. So anytime.
All right. Well, let's take another question. But please try to be brief in your questions so that we can take as many
please.
as...
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. My husband and I visited Egypt just a year ago, and were very impressed and heard the rumblings and the dissatisfaction with what's been going on under Mubarak and over the years, and so we were so elated and shocked to find out what has happened. But in addition, I really understand the other comments that have been made, and also register my concern. How I want to ask you about your assessment of the various groupings and how you think that, I mean, you know, how do you, it's hard to forecast, but, you know, just a sense of where do you, how do you think it's going to go and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And please.
Just talking about narratives, which is what Edward Said had really emphasized. What I see is beyond the democratic reforms, sooner or later Egypt and many other countries that sort of collapse undergo tremendous economic stress, particularly in a country where the demographics are skewed towards the younger people. And somebody has to give them jobs and somebody has to feed them. And if I were working for AIPAC, this is where the potential counter-narrative can come in. They can say 3 years from now, well, they have democracy, but they can't take care of themselves. The place is now chaotic or something like that. I would like to know what your thoughts are or what you hear about potential solutions, economic solutions, to giving opportunities to the, I guess, more or less the younger people in these countries.
Sure. And we might as well. We'll do.
Hi. Well, first the comments. This is actually the second time I hear you speak. The first time was about 10 years ago, back in the Alexandra Library. I was still a student then. That was a crossroads. I think this is another big crossroads. My question is a bit more general, less specific. I was wondering if you could address the youth who are living abroad, who, myself included, find themselves at a crossroads at this point, whether it's in terms of figuring out if this is a good point, whether to return, or how they would address this crossroads. I think perhaps also you had a similar experience many years ago, and wanted to know if you could comment on that.
Sure, thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, please.
I was a student here in 2000, so I wanted to thank you for the ways that you've honored the memory of Edward Said tonight. And I wanted to ask, as an activist and an organizer now, I was glued to Al Jazeera watching these tactics unfold in Egypt. What tactics and tools coming out of this revolution do you think are applicable for the international community of organizers, whether Wisconsin or elsewhere? I think there's a tremendous amount we have to learn. And the second piece is, what are the implications of the new Egyptian era for the people in Gaza, for the Palestinians, for the siege on Gaza that continues?
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Right. Is anybody else going to come forward? Because if it's just two people now, then we'll take them, and then that's, yeah? Okay, so it's two people. So the gentleman, are you, yeah?
Yes, I wanted to thank you for your comments tonight.
Thank you.
This lecture represents kind of a after for me. I was in Egypt studying last semester, and I had the pleasure of attending an Edward Said memorial lecture there, and it was probably one of the most poignant nights that I had in Egypt. And there, Professor Butler, who I'm not certain...
Who is with us this evening,
here.
Yes.
The most powerful point was her recitation of, I believe, and I'm very new to all of this, but Darwish, the contrapuntal dialogue. And he spoke of my dream for you is the impossible. And so I just was wondering if inviting any comments you have about this and Tahrir, the revolution, and being a part of that dream fulfillment.
Thank you. Well, I think you've said it really. I mean, you know, what can be said beyond that? Okay, the last.
Yes, and I was intrigued, I thought, by all of what you said, but especially I thought the fact that the old models don't fit. But there's something very important. I thought also you didn't talk about Facebook and Twitter. I think that's very important because it's not the technology, it's the people empowered by the technology. And there's a term that came from Columbia University in the work of a young researcher here a number of years ago called Netizen, which has been embraced around the world. It's the people online empowered by the internet. And he discovered that the people empowered were able to create something different, and they also wanted to be citizens in the deepest sense of the world, creating a better world. And they found they could do it because they had the internet. I think what you describe of Tahrir Square is what a lot of people find on the internet, that it can be flat, it's not hierarchical, there's a different quality. I thought my question is the sense of the future and how you create the future. What is your sense of how much this sense of the strength of Tahrir some of it has come from people's experience as netizens on the internet, and that maybe that helps to give some of the model for the future. And by the way, in South Korea, people have explored that. In China, in some ways, people are exploring that, even though that's not known. There's been a long history on the internet of people exploring that. So I don't know if that's something that you're aware of, but I think that's important, because the question is, where does that vision for the future come from, and the models to make it work? And thank you for sharing as much as you have with us.
Thank you so much for this. Okay, maybe
Ahdaf, if you're taking all the questions, I have a final question to ask as well. It's a very simple one. I have been very concerned about the identification of all the Arab revolutions as revolutions of the youth. And it's not as if the Russian or the French revolutions were carried out by the middle-aged and the elderly. So I'm a bit confused as to what exactly makes the Arab Revolution younger than the Russian or the Iranian or the French revolutions. And if not, and as we know, there are people in there as young as in their 40s and 50s and 60s who were part of this revolution. What's at stake in this identification of it as a revolution of the youth?
Is that a trick question?
And I'll stop you.
I kind of have a feeling that there is something behind this.
No, none. Just
okay. Well, basically, to put it very simply, the people who actually organized the protests that went out on the 25th of January, which kick-started the process in Egypt, were all under 35. So, and they were the Facebook groups and so on, and so, they were under 35, and so it became known as that. And in terms of the participation in the protests that marched through the streets to begin with, and so on, there were more young people than older ones, because that's the natural demographic. It's perfectly well recognized. It is perfectly well recognized that, in fact, when you then look at Tahrir, starting from, say, the 29th of January, there are old people, young people, children, middle-aged people. In fact, it was a very noted aspect of the population that you had 4 generations there. And that was sort of meant to be a great strength. However, of course, in Arabic, ثورة الشباب وشباب الثورة, and the word shabab has such wonderful kind of like resonance and connotations. And you have a shabab for Palestine, of course. You always say shabab did this, the young people did this and did that, and the young people of the revolution. So there is a rhetorical ring to it, and why not? Basically, I think if you've got a phrase that works, that has resonance, that has a ring, and it's sticking, well, use it. It's not like, so it's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just felt excluded, that's why.
No, don't. We are all honorary shabab. So it's fine, But on that, on the issue of the internet, I have heard of what you're talking about, but I am not the person to speak to it. I just really wish that on this podium now, there were some of the real young people of this revolution, my son, my nephew, my nieces, and so on, because they could speak about a lot of this so much better than I. The fact is that, it is true that they have been able to do what we have not. And so to be sort of sitting kind of pontificating about what they should do now and where this should go now is kind of a little bit false to my mind. And what we now being the oldies have have said and repeatedly say to them is you guys have done this, and we really respect you, we're very proud of you, and our role now is to put everything that we still have at your disposal. You tell us how you want to use us, and we will do what you want. And this is really completely genuine. And in fact, I think that our youth, our shabab, are somewhat bemused, by this new. I mean, you're standing in Tahrir, and this guy catches my eye, and he's got his son next to him, who's a young man, and he says to me, I used to really think very little of him. I was always on at him about how he's always with his technology, about the dropped jeans, the boxers showing. And look at him, I've been apologizing to him. And so all these poor young people, and the ones sweeping the streets, and constantly older people rushing up to shake them by the hand and kiss them and congratulate them, and they're sort of being polite about it. But yes. So basically, I really wish they were here to address some of these things. And I'm sure that basically citizenship on the internet was probably a great training ground, because you could do all this citizenship stuff on the net with little risk, and then you took it onto into reality. But I can only guess at that. The whole all the questions about the counter-revolution, we know. I mean, we all share this concern, and I think it is very heartwarming and very healthy and very natural that you are voicing these concerns. They are deeply felt. One of the speakers said that there had been an order from the military to massacre the people, and that the order had been disobeyed by the middle ranks. That is one story. But there is another story, which is supposed to be from a very reliable source, that the order was given by the president the day that he flew the jets over us, which was the Monday after Friday the 28th. So the Monday after his I'm an old man speech, the Monday before his I'm an old man speech, where suddenly there were these fighter jets sort of flying over us. And the word is that day he gave the command to activate code whatever 64BX, which meant massacre the people, and that Field Marshal.
I guess Gaddafi was listening.
And that Field Marshal Tantawi said, "Ma aqdarx ya Rais, I can't do it." So that's another story. That it was at that level that the order was rejected. So. We don't know. Obviously, Amr Moussa, yes, he's thrown his hat in the ring. It's noted the propinquity of that to Mr. Lieberman's visit. Also, a tape that then started being played over and over again and has had lots of views on the internet is a video of Mr. Amr Moussa a year ago saying, of course, if President Mubarak puts himself forward for president, I would support him. And so things people are aware. Where is Mr. Omar Suleiman? Again, that was a question that was voiced in the square many times. Where is Mr. Omar Suleiman? Where is Mr. Zakaria Azmi? What do they do when they wake up? Omar Suleiman wakes up in the morning. How does he occupy himself? We would like to know. And the next thing was that the military gave a communique saying the presidential palace is empty, and Mr. Omar Suleiman and Mr. Zakaria Azmi have no authority and no power, and they are staying at home. So, basically the street is really aware and really savvy and is voicing the questions. But the forces of the counter-revolution are there. Yes, today the Baltagiya attacked 200 women. people were saying yesterday, women were saying yesterday that it was not a good idea at the moment to call for a million women's march, and that it was not going to be a million, and that, okay, maybe we'll just say that that was a figure of speech, and that now when we want a big demo, we call it a million, and so on. And so basically, if at the moment you have 200 women going out and sort of being revolutionaries on their own, they are susceptible to being attacked by the Baltageya, which is what happened and which is terrible, and it is another step, another part of the process to show the regime for what it is. And the Mabahith Amn al-Dawla, exactly the same thing. We know that they need to be purged. This was a central demand of the revolution from day one. We are closer to having it happen now than we were when Ahmad Shafiq's ministry was in place and when so many of their buildings were not under the control of the revolutionary cabinet. So absolutely the counter-revolution is active. Absolutely people know about it and are trying to outflank it and to deactivate it, and who knows what will happen before things kind of settle in place. What is going to happen beyond the democratic reform? I mean, there were a whole set of questions that were basically about the future. What is going to happen beyond the democratic reforms? What is my assessment? I am really not a political analyst. What I can say is that there is a process that has taken place and that has resulted in where we are now, which to my mind is infinitely better than where we were 2 months ago. And that process continues. You know, we can feel it. We can feel it happening. We can feel the conversation. We can feel the pushing, the nudging. We can feel the taking of positions. It's an ongoing process. And I think that what we need to do is we need to trust it, and we need to feed into it, and everybody needs to carry on doing what they're doing now, which is being alert, thinking, being creative, being proactive. So when people saw men coming out of the state security building carrying rubbish bags, they went and challenged them. And it was because of this, because of challenging them, and because of insisting on seeing what was in there, and then being proactive and moving in and fighting them and taking over the building and tweeting it so that people all over the country moved in and took over buildings of state security. This is the kind of process that I'm talking about. And the more it happens, and the more people feel enabled and feel agents of, you know, of their environment and of what is happening, the more chance there is of success in all these things. But it is an ongoing story. And obviously, potential role for youth. What I can tell you is that already people are saying that democracy is not enough. That democracy is a necessary condition, but it is not a sufficient condition. And this is because they see that in the democratic countries of the West, democracy does not deliver the will of the people. You know, you have millions of people out on the streets protesting against entering into the Iraq War, and what happens? The Iraq War happens. So, you know, everybody knows now, and that is very much being put forward, that democracy is not enough, and we need to think of what is beyond that. What are the forms that we need to... And I am certain that the youth are going to be very much a part of that. I'm going to address two more things very quickly. One is the question of the youth abroad. The Egyptian youth, the Arab youth, the dual heritage youth, and the other is the question of Gaza. So on the issue of young people abroad, we saw many people coming back to Egypt during the revolution. It was like you kept bumping into people in Tahrir that you had last seen in Brussels, or that you knew were studying in Dallas. You know, hey, what do you do? Oh, you know, I just dropped everything and came. And many people are taking the position that we're now coming home. I mean, certainly my son is doing that. And, you know, sons of many other people I know, and so they say, we're coming home, there is now something to work for. And everybody wants to come and put their shoulder to the wheel and contribute. I guess that if you have the tremendous impulse to do that, then you do it. If you are wondering whether to do it or not, then maybe the right thing for you is to wait and see how things develop. But there is very definitely a big, and there is also a desire to be included. I mean, again, my son and friends were saying this is an issue that has to be addressed, that basically it has to come out into the open, that we people who are living abroad or who have lived abroad, we need to be able to vote, we need to be able to have a say in the political process, and we need to be, I mean, there are people who feel Egyptian but who can't speak Arabic, yeah? And they want to be part of the process. And I certainly, and very many people, believe that they should be, and that in fact it is a tremendous strength. We have about 4 million Egyptians living abroad, and we have very many friends of Egypt abroad. And this is an amazing resource that we should embrace, we should pull in, and we should use. And finally, to something very, very important, the Palestinian issue and Gaza. I think that Gaza was very much part of the reason why this revolution happened. This has been a long time in the making, and various things have happened along the way which have all added to the pressure and led up to it. And Gaza, the bombardment of Gaza, the role that Egypt played, the wall that we have enforced, the killing of people in the tunnels, the steel wall that Egypt, sort of going one up on the Israelis, is building a steel wall underneath the ground to prevent. This has all just been anathema to the Egyptian people. And of course, the regime has known that, and of course, the regime has used its ploys so that the Palestinians want to take over. I mean, I actually had one posh lady at the Gezira Club saying to me, but the Palestinians, but Gaza, but Hamas, they want to come and occupy Egypt. And you say, well, do you know how many they are? Do you know how many they are? What with sort of with their Qassam rockets, they're just going to come and. So basically, that is like it's a very big factor. The way that Egyptians feel about the role that Egypt has been playing in the Palestinian issue, and before we even come to Palestine, a government that governs, that runs Egypt or that administers Egypt with the interests of the Egyptian people at heart, is going to very quickly find itself in conflict with Israel. Because for a start, it's not going to want to sell them our gas, it's not going to want to lease them our land, it's not going to want to import their cancerous fertilizers. It's going to have to stop a whole raft of it will insist that we have the right to administer Sinai in the way that we see fit, and so on. And so it is bound to come into conflict with Israel and with what Israel sees as its interests before we even come to the question of Palestine. And Gaza, of course, even before the rest of Palestine, there is already talk of, the million-man march into Gaza and so on. Things will happen. Ideally, of course, we will have a proper international border, which is administered properly very soon. So definitely, if the Egyptian revolution continues along the path that is good for Egypt and the Egyptians, it will be good for Palestine, it will be good for Gaza, it will even be good for the rest of the Arab world. It might even be good for the region as a whole if it forces the Israelis to take stock of the situation and to be more accommodating, perhaps, in how they deal with us. So I think we have probably really outstayed our welcome. I thank you very, very much for being here.
Thank you, Ahdaf.